Hello everyone. This video will continue our discussion about the 8 elements of music. So here we'll begin with number 5, which is texture. So you may have already been familiar with several of the musical elements we've discussed so far: melody, rhythm, harmony. Those get used pretty often in our daily lives, I think. So texture might actually be a new concept for us here. So texture refers to the number of lines, or also known as musical voices, and the number of them and how they relate with one another and what their function within that piece of music is. So in general terms, using adjectives, we can describe textures as being kind of thin and sparse, or we can use words like dense and thick to describe textures that have many voices, all carrying similar functions and weights of importance. So I want to look at 3 classifications of texture that we'll be using in this course: monophonic, homophonic, and polyphonic. Those are all ways to describe texture. So in the next few slides, we'll go over the definitions and I'll play you some examples. So monophony here is easier to understand if you sort of divide the word up here. So mono means one, and phone, P-H-O-N, means sound. So one sound, essentially. This is the simplest texture, so the least complicated, but that doesn't mean that it's actually the most commonly used. It's only heard in certain styles of music, pretty rarely. So I've illustrated on the screen monophony in graphic form using a wavy line. You can see the contour of the melody, and that line represents this one melody with nothing else. So a monophonic line is one single melody without any harmony. So I challenge you to take a second here and think about examples of monophonic music, styles that use monophony quite a bit. It might be actually pretty challenging to think of times where you hear monophony happening. So one example on the next slide here, we'll look at a very We'll look at a very famous example of a monophonic song, and that's Happy Birthday, right? So whenever you get together and celebrating someone's birthday, the whole group sings. You're singing generally in unison, so everybody's singing the same pitches, the same rhythms, and you're producing a monophonic song. So monophony doesn't necessarily mean that it is literally only one voice or one instrument being played. You can have a whole group performing in unison and still consider that to be monophony, right? So, to play you an example here. Happy birthday, that was a monophonic line. Even if you all were singing along with me, it would still be considered monophonic. So actually the earliest notated music that we have in the Western classical tradition from the Middle Ages was monophonic, possibly because it was easy to notate that way. Notating harmony takes a little bit more skill. So I want to play you next 2 quick examples of monophonic song from different genres. So right here we see an example of Gregorian chant. This is from the Middle Ages, would be sung by monks in a monastery. We have a whole group of them all singing simultaneously in unison, and while there's a bit of some reverb or echo, they're all singing the same melody in a monophonic texture. Alright, so very early example of monophony there. Next I'll play you a more recent example. This is the famous Jesse Norman performing Amazing Grace. And as you can see on the screen, this is considered to be an a cappella piece, which means voice only, no musical instruments. Amazing grace.
sweet the song that seemed a wretch like me.
All right, so two drastically different examples, but both would be considered to be monophonic. So now next let's look at homophony, which is not the simplest texture, but it is the most common texture. So I would say the vast majority of music that you hear in your daily lives that you probably enjoy listening to would be considered to be homophonic. So homophony is defined as a main melody, so we can take, for example, our monophonic melody earlier, but you're going to add an accompaniment to it. And so there's a hierarchy here. The main melody is the most important part. That's the main tune of the piece. And the accompaniment provides harmonic support, but it is not the main character per se. So the hierarchy there is important. So you can see on the screen the graphic here. The orange line represents our main melody, and this solid yellow color represents the harmonic support that's being provided in this homophonic texture. So if you think about most pieces of pop music, for example, you turn on the radio, the vast majority of that is going to be homophonic. So for example, a Taylor Swift song, what's the hierarchy there? Where's the main melody? Of course, it's the part that Taylor Swift is singing, and if you get the song stuck in your head, then it's probably the melody that Taylor Swift was singing that's stuck in your head. Whereas there might be other instruments supporting her, guitars or percussion or whatever. They are the accompaniment, so there is a hierarchy there. A good example of homophony here is Bob Dylan. And this is him performing 1963, Blowing in the Wind. And so you can see a great example, he's playing guitar, he's accompanying himself on guitar, and then singing the main melody.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? Yes, and how many seas must the white dove see before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many times must the cannonballs fly before they fall out of the van? The answer, my friend, is a blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Okay, so there Bob Dylan is clearly singing the main melody. He's simply strumming chords on the guitar for harmonic support, but the guitar part alone wouldn't stand alone as a good melody necessarily. When he starts playing the harmonica, we can say that the harmonica takes over as the primary melody there, so it does remain homophonic. Okay, so now we'll end by talking about the probably least common and most sort of complicated texture, which is polyphony. So poly means many, phone means sound. So here we're going to be talking about many melodic lines, each equally important, happening at the same time. So in terms of, if we were using adjectives, we'd say this is a very dense, sort of thick texture. Whereas monophonic would be a very sparse or thin texture. So here is a look at some musical notation. This is a Bach fugue. Again, you don't need to be able to read the notation here, but I think just as a visual sort of graphic image, you can see that there's a lot of notes, there's a lot of black on the page there. So it is a very thick, dense texture, and each one of these lines you could trace would stand alone as a great melody on its own, but then we've got three of them stacked on top of each other, so very dense and thick. So that's a classical music example, but I want to show you a more recent example of polyphony. This is Terry Riley's In C, a live performance. And here we have many performers all on different instruments, and they're all playing at the same time. They each have their own specific little melody. And so it sounds beautiful, it sounds cool, but it's hard to actually pick out one that's the main melody, and that's because there is no main melody. Alright, so that's a great piece. I suggest watching the full video if you get a chance. And that concludes our discussion of texture. So monophony, homophony, and polyphony. So the next video I will be discussing timbre. Thanks for watching.